So in this video, we're just going to go through Kripke's description of the description theory, list the important theses that he draws out, and just say something about why we should think that these really are a core part of the description theory. So the list is pretty long, and we're going to go through them relatively slowly and carefully. But as I said, one of the really nice things about what Kripke is doing is that he's spelling out in really great detail what versions of the description theory there are. Like what is the description theory really committed to? Because as we said, it was last time, it was a little bit unclear, like what is the core of the description theory? And this is what Kripke thinks is at the core. By the way, I'm going to give these all names, so Kripke just gives them numbers. It's hard to, especially since the list gets so long, it's hard to just keep those numbers in mind. So I'm giving them my own names, and ones that should help you remember what they say relatively easily. So the first thesis he discusses is the one which I'm going to call cluster. And what cluster says is that for each name, there's a cluster of properties. We're going to call them the phis. And speakers believe that the thing picked out by X, whatever it is, satisfies those properties. So we can just spell that out using an example. We can think of the Kanye West example from last time. According to the description theory, there would be a cluster of properties associated with that, like the guy who interrupted Taylor Swift, the guy who was married to Kim Kardashian, the guy who made the album Yeezus. We have a cluster of properties associated with the name, and speakers in general believe that the name Kanye West, whoever the guy picked out by the name Kanye West, has these properties. So that's the cluster thesis. And we already said last time why the description theory might be committed to the cluster thesis. Because it just doesn't look like we can in general find just like a single description that for all users of the name that is going to be used by them and is what they're going to use to understand the meaning of the name. So really for the view to have any plausibility, we have to have this cluster rather than a single description. The second thesis is what I'm going to call uniqueness. And uniqueness says one of the properties, or some combination of the properties, picks out some object uniquely. Why is this part of the description theory? Well, remember the idea we saw last week. The idea was, well, really to think about something, unless we're acquainted with it, we got to figure out, we have to have some way of fixing on the person that we're actually thinking about. And a natural thought is, well, to fix on a particular person you're thinking about, even when you haven't been in contact with them like perceptually or introspectively or something like that. A natural thought is, well, you use that with a description that you know they satisfy uniquely. You do it with some set of properties that you know they satisfy. And that is essentially what the uniqueness thesis is saying. It's saying that the properties that are associated with the name, either one of the properties or some combinations of them, uniquely pick out the thing that the name is used to talk about. Because there's just this general idea behind the view that that's often what's necessary to like single out a particular object in thought in the first place. The next thesis, which I'm calling satisfaction, follows on very naturally from uniqueness. And satisfaction just says if most of the properties, most of the phis, uniquely pick out some object, or that there's exactly one object that has most of those properties, then X is the name of that object. So suppose, for instance, there's exactly one thing that interrupted Taylor Swift, that was married to Kim Kardashian, that produced the album Yeezus, then that object, Kanye West, is the thing that the name Kanye West picks out. I won't spend too much time on this, because I think it's like the most obvious of why this would be part of the description theory. It is worth noticing maybe that Kripke says most here, so most of the properties, because we had this discussion last week about, how many properties should be necessary. How many properties is it necessary for the thing to have in order for the name to pick out something? But it's worth noticing that Kripke is actually here giving a sufficient condition and not a necessary one. In particular, he's not saying the name picks out an object only if it picks out most of those. Rather, he's saying picking it for most of the descriptions to pick out something, or most of the properties to pick out something, is sufficient for the name to pick out that thing. And that is something that in general, any variation of the description theory should, I think, agree to. They may disagree about how much is necessary, but they should all agree that most is sufficient. The next thesis is called Nonexistence. And nonexistence says if no unique object is picked out by the properties, then the name does not refer. And this again seems sort of in keeping with the general picture behind the description theory. Because the idea is, well, if you associate with a name a bunch of properties, but it just turns out that there's nothing that has those properties, then the name just doesn't refer to anything. Because remember, the idea is that the properties associated with a name, they're the things that fix its reference, or they're the things that go into the description, which means the same things. So if there's nothing with those properties, then there just cannot be anything which that name talks about. The next principle is one I'm calling a priority, and what it says is that speakers know a priori the sentence that if X exists, then X has most of the phi's. Or remember, the phi's are the properties associated with the name. Okay, so why should you think that? This one requires a little bit more explanation. The idea is, well, remember, on the description theory, part of what it is to know the meaning of a name is to know that these properties are associated with the name. So knowing the name Kanye West is knowing that there is a bunch of descriptions associated with it. And then the idea is, well, consider the sentence, if Kanye West exists, then he has most of the phi's, where the phi's are the properties like interrupted Taylor Swift, was married to Kim Kardashian, etc., etc. Kripke thinks, well, if you're a description theorist, you should say that that sentence is something you know a priori, or can know a priori. That is, you don't need to go out into the world and see whether it's true or not. Rather, it's something you can know simply because you know the meaning of the name. So let's think about that for a moment. Why would you say that if you're a description theorist? Well, remember, according to the description theory, in order to master the name in the first place, in order to know that Kanye West, the name Kanye West, picks out Kanye West, you have to know that there's this list of properties associated with it. Now, you don't need to know the whole list, but you need to know, like, a sizable amount of it. So you just don't know what the name means until you know those things. But if that's what it takes to know the meaning of a name, then it looks like once you do know the meaning, then you're automatically in a position to know that that sentence we just talked about is true. The sentence, if Kanye West exists, then he has most of the phi's, or the phi's are the identifying properties. Because, sort of knowing that that list of properties is associated with the name, well, that's exactly what goes into knowing the meaning of the name in the first place. So once you know the meaning of the name, it looks like you should be in a position to know that that sentence is true, just because of what you know when you know the meaning. The last thesis, which Kripke spells out as being part of the description theory, is very similar to the a priority one, and it's what I'll call necessity. And necessity just says it's a necessary truth that if X exists, then it has most of the phi's. And the reasoning here is kind of similar to with the previous principle, as you might expect. Because remember, the idea is that these properties are sort of what fix the reference of the name in the first place. They're what determine that when a name is talking about a particular object, that is the object it's talking about. It's the properties associated with the name Kanye West on the description view that determine that we're talking about Kanye West and not somebody else. But again, if that's just for part of the way the name works, how could it be false that Kanye West has most of the phi's? If the phi's are what make sure that the name Kanye West refers to that person, then surely it will always have to be true that if Kanye West exists, he has the list of identifying properties. Or put more generally, if X, for some name, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's. It looks like that sentence is going to have to be necessarily true. True in all possible worlds. Because those properties are what fix the reference of the name in the first place. They're part of the meaning of the name. So those are a bunch of theses we've gone through. As we can see, they're much more precise than anything we've seen stated in any of the by any of the proponents of the Frege-Russell theory. And as a side note, there's an important lesson here, because it's partly because Kripke formulated these theses really clearly and really precisely that he was able to argue very convincingly to pretty much everyone in philosophy at the time that the theory had to be wrong. By formulating these theses really precisely, he made it much easier to see that there are potential counterexamples to them. And so that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to look at most of these principles, in particular the core principles, and see the kinds of counterexamples that Kripke gave to each of the principles.